All right, welcome to the Spindle Sidebar. This is a special episode of the Spindle. If you're familiar with the Spindle podcast, we usually do each episode on a single 7-inch record. But this time we're diving pretty deep into a band's full discography, a band who had a lot of good 7-inches actually, but we're going to deal mostly with their albums today, and they're the Byrds. If you've been listening to us the whole way from the beginning, our very first episode was about Husker Du's cover of the Byrds 8 Miles High. And we got into the Byrds a little bit there, but we wanted to do sort of a special episode where we really dig into a lot of their albums because John knows a
John's
ton about the
obsessed with the
Byrds.
Byrds and insisted
Exactly. And he
that
can
we
tell you
talk
something
more
awesome
about the
about every
Byrds.
album. And I can sort of sit here and react. I've heard them all, but I don't know that much about them. So it's going to be educational for me as well as for everybody watching. So where do we start?
Yes, John's obsessed with the Byrds, so he insisted that Mark sit here with him while he talks about the Byrds. But I like the idea that Mark's a fan, but not like me, a kind of read all the books and owns all the records fan, because I think it'll give a good reaction or a good sense to a music fan about maybe why the Byrds are important and why there's more to them than a lot of people think. Like it's the impression is basically Mr. Tambourine Man, Turn, Turn, Turn. I was born in the 60s. Those songs were everywhere through the early 70s. I grew up hearing them. And so Byrds were kind of one of the 60s groups I liked, along with Jefferson Airplane, which makes sense when you think about it, those two groups. And what I found about the Byrds, and I still love Jefferson Airplane, but the Byrds are really, really interesting because they were so early to so many things. And those guys, before they were the Byrds, had already been successful. Like they were in things like the New Christy Minstrels. Roger McGuinn, Jim McGuinn at the time was all over. His fingerprints are all over folk music. He was a successful folk musician before anybody heard of Dylan, working with Judy Collins and Chad Mitchell Trio and people like that, arranging and things. Gene Clark was in the New Christy Minstrels and was starting to make a name for himself as a songwriter. And they found themselves at odds, though, with the folk world because they were a little bit rock and rollers from before folk, but they knew when they heard the Beatles that it just caught their ear, like, wow, we can soup this stuff up and it'd sound great. I mean, I really think it's that simple. Young dudes are like loud, fast, loud, fast. Hey, what if I do the stuff I like loud, fast? And we don't have perspective on it. But at the time, stuff like the Byrds or the Beatles sounded like you discofied things because it's given it that backbeat, that stomp and dance beat. It doesn't sound that way to us anymore in a way, but those bands were famous for making people dance. And the Byrds in particular, people would dance to them for hours when they first started at Ciro's in LA and places like that. And it's a sort of a forgotten aspect of that sound. So in some ways, they're taking the folk rock sound, was turning folk into dance music, switching it from a 2-beat to a 4-beat, and making it more like a Motown-y heavy, rock, like rockabilly rock kind of sound, or a big band swing, which is another rocking kind of sound. And it's a sort of underappreciated aspect of their origins. I think people think of them as a light vocal group in a lot of ways. But in reality, they were very heavy for their time. It's just they came so early that heavy meant something very different then. They're like pretty much right after the Beatles. Their first record came out in late 64, and then Mr. Tambourine Man came out at the beginning of 65. And so their journey is very interesting and kind of tracks with a lot of the other 60s music because they led so much of it.
Mm-hmm.
What is your impression of the Byrds as just a kind of a somebody who might enjoy some of their records? Like,
Well, I mean, I obviously until recently, until I started listening to more of the albums than I had heard growing up and stuff, I thought of them as kind of a 60s pop band. But the thing that always stuck with me was their guitar sound. The I don't know if you call it the twang or whatever of the way the twang and drone of the melodies and stuff. It's always been really distinctive to me. I mean, that's the one thing I don't really think a whole lot of other bands from then or since then sound like. And when a band does sound like it, it's very clear because that they're an influence, because there really isn't a ton else like that particular part of the sound. I also knew, David Crosby was in it, and I kind of got them a little mushed as I was growing up with Crosby, Stills, and that kind of scene, which is a much different kind of ball game.
Yeah, it really is. It really totally is.
Yeah, yeah,
In a lot of ways, that's a good
yeah.
observation.
Yeah. So that it took me a while to get past that part of it because I just never hadn't dove into them in a long time, or really ever. I mostly have just listened to the singles until relatively recently. I'd hear an album all the way through every once in a while, but still what would stick with me was the songs I had kind of known before. Um, but yeah, I mean, going through it now, I'm sort of amazed how much they managed to mine and how much they changed. And I never had really ever heard of them as a band that developed or that, you know, did different styles, were different from album to album. That's something I had never really known until I listened to them all in a row.
And they're one of the earliest bands to do that.
Right.
Like really
Right.
kind of like they're
Mhm.
in there, like they inspired the Beatles to change up their sound,
Uh-huh.
and we'll get to that
Mhm.
later. But I mean, I think when I say that, you can think of the moment that happened with the Beatles. You can
Right.
hear when they heard the Byrds. There's before they heard the Byrds, and then there's after they heard the Byrds, and that was a return of the favor though, because the Byrds heard the Beatles and heard the 12th string the Beatles were using in Hard Day's Night, and that kind of kick-started because McGuinn already played 12 string and he played banjo, and he's like, what if I play an electric 12 string like a banjo, meaning throw
Mm.
that drone, that like a banjo has a steady drone note that goes with it. And so he does that with the 12 string, and that's what gives it. Nobody really plays it like he does still. Like all
Hmm.
those jangle pop bands kind of don't. I mean, they sound like the Byrds for sure, and some of them are great bands. Some of them I like a lot, but they do miss that weirdo drone thing that the Byrds have. That their Byrds are psychedelic from the get go. Like all those guys had already experienced that and experimented before they were even the Byrds. Because the folk scene was very much like the beatnik scene, heavily involved with drugs, hallucinogens, pot, speed, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so they brought that to the table immediately. And who is it who calls it drone cognizance? Is that Byron Coley or Lester
Yeah.
Bangs or somebody like that? And that's very much the heart of the Byrds, and it's why they got into Indian music so easily too. But I guess we'll just start with the narrative here, though. It's just
Cool.
it'll be interesting to hear what you think of each of the albums as we go through them too.
Yeah.
So most of my facts I got from the Byrds books are all really good. The greatest, I guess, one of the great biographies I've ever read of any musical group ever is Johnny Rogan's two-part biography, Requiem for the Timeless. This thing is no joke, and there's two of them.
Wow.
And not only are they the definitive biography of the Byrds, but within it, it contains definitive biographies of Gene Clark and Graham Parsons and Michael Clark and all the dead Byrds. So it's a crazy book. He really just the detail. I don't always agree with him in his
Hmm.
aesthetic assessments. He definitely is like we scoff, but he's a bit of a Crosby, Stills and Nash kind of person, and so he kind of overrates some of that stuff to my taste. But as far as detail and knowing stuff about the Byrds, these are just unbelievable books. It's just
Hmm.
crazy how much he knows, but also how much they did in just an extremely short period of time. It's really kind of nuts that they were a band for 7 years.
And 2 volumes of that. Yeah. That's
Two
amazing.
volumes, and
Hmm.
it's full of stuff. Like it's completely full of stuff. It's like there's no dead spots. It's all,
Wow. Uh-huh.
action packed. Another great one, and I'm addicted to all of these books, is the Day by Day for the Byrds. I think people might nap on this one. There's a great one for the Monkees, a great one for the Velvet Underground. This one's nuts because reading any of those, you see how different life was for the people working in the music industry in the 60s. These guys would literally be playing a gig till 2 in the morning and then be expected to be at the studio playing clean takes at 10 a.m. and then would go do TV around dinner time, and then go play a couple sets, and that would be a day. And we'll get to the emotional toll that started to take on some of the members. Now, these guys were all pros, like all of them were actual pros. There's a myth about the Byrds that they kind of, that they couldn't play and stuff like that, and Michael Clark in particular. But these guys had been through the ringer, but that meant that they weren't so sure they wanted to go through the ringer over and over again,
Right.
that they didn't
Right. Right.
necessarily think that was good for them.
Right. And this was a relatively common story, just to say a relatively common thing that happened when a band got hits back in the 60s is that the level of prolificness and the expected and that they were able to do. I mean, CCR went through the same thing where they're just
It's
making music, so much music in such small amounts of time that burnout is really hard to avoid with those
Well, and
kind of
it's under
groups.
discussed historically and how the contracts drove these bands. Like watching Get Back, everybody thinks, oh, it's a bunch of friends wondering to break up. No, it's a business trying to figure out how to get out of their next contracts, how to finish off the contract legally. Once that contract is done, then are they going to get another contract? Who's going to help them negotiate that? That's the story of
Right.
Get Back. I mean, it really
Right.
is. And same thing
Uh-huh.
with the Byrds, who had a number of
Mhm.
contracts that nowadays we would see them as onerous, like they're supposed to deliver like two singles and two LPs a year at certain
Right.
points. I mean,
Right.
I
Right.
don't think it's, I
Yeah.
don't like to go into contract details necessarily, but their career was very much driven by, we've got to finish this contract out so we can get the next payment. And, um, so that kind of drives it too. Like we always want to think it's creativity or something like that, but it's also hard business decisions
Right. It's this machinery in
about
a lot of ways. Yeah.
it's right, right. And it is what it is. They signed up. They knew that was what the music business was like. Everybody knew it. You wanted to get there so that you were chopping that stuff out, and then you hoped it stayed there for a couple years, which is different than how they approach things now. The other thing I love is this book that came out this year. I don't know why I bought this, but it's beautiful. All the pictures are beautiful. A lot of great details. A lot of it's almost all in their own words. So it's very valuable in knowing what the Byrds themselves thought in certain situations, which can be a bit opaque
Uh-huh.
in a way. Like they're a very interesting group in that way, and their inner dynamics and stuff like that. One of the most interesting. So we'll just start at the beginning, which is that those guys met kicking around the folk world. They ended up in LA, and Gene Clark and Jim McGuinn at the time, Roger McGuinn now, um, were singing together Beatles songs. And so they would kind of play these harder edged Beatles songs, but in a folk style to folk audiences who would get annoyed with them. And they would go to open mic hoots or they played at certain places. I think musicians were liking it better than the audiences. So one of these performances, David Crosby came up to them, and he already had met probably both of them off and on occasionally in New York and other places. And they decided to sing together, and he literally just joined in with them, and he's a great harmony singer, and they're like, oh, this will work. And he's like, great, I know a guy who is recording um, over at a studio here in LA, and he wants to do demos. He's looking for a group. And so that led to the recordings that ended up being released in Pre-Flight. And
Mm.
so that guy is Jim Dixon, and he's pretty much responsible for putting the Byrds together. The Byrds, like the Monkees, are a boy group founded on looking good and pretty and singing good
Mm.
harmonies, and they were put together deliberately, both for their look and what they brought musically to the table. They came together though really quickly. Like originally, Crosby was going to play bass. McGuinn and Clark were going to be the guitarists, and they had found Michael Clark, who was playing. He's a jazz fan, but he would play with a lot of the folk people on the West Coast, and so he played with these guys, played congas and percussion and stuff like that. But he knew how to play a drum kit, you know. But he was
Mhm.
young, and he looked like Brian Jones, and so they're like, "Okay, you're in." And then they found Chris Hillman, who was playing in country bands, playing bass and mandolin, mostly mandolin, and singing. But he wanted to play bass, and he was getting into like R&B and stuff like that, and wanted to expand that. So he became the bassist. The story goes that Crosby basically browbeat Gene Clark into giving up the guitar so that Crosby could play guitar. They had to get Hillman for that reason. And this is an early sense of the dynamics of the band. It's
Mhm.
like there's a lot of placating Crosby while he throws some sort of a tantrum. Um, but these recordings on Pre-Flight are all really good. Like if this is all that existed, they'd be considered one of the great lost 60s bands, because they're these really good, better than pastiches. It's basically like taking their own songwriting and just being like, well, what if we put a backbeat to it and soup it up? And
Mhm.
some of the songs are, I guess you'd call them underdeveloped as commercial material, but it's all really interesting, and it shows how people were immediately seeing this angle of turning up a bit and hitting the backbeat harder and using that to drive music, which is really the big change between the schmaltzier stuff of the early 60s and what what came after the Beatles, kind of,
And these are things that
and
weren't released at the time.
well, they were in their first record came out in Elektra, but they were called the Beefeaters. And so a couple of these songs were packaged together as a single. The Beefeaters, of course, supposed to make them sound English, a little bit like the Sir
Right,
Douglas
right.
Quintet or something like that did the same kind of thing. And so that single flopped, didn't do anything. So all the rights, I think, reverted. Nobody cared at the time. But what apparently they started playing in clubs in LA and people started really liking them because at the time there wasn't a lot of this overamped stuff going on. And apparently live, they were a heavier proposition than we hear on record. They made them turn down. Live reports, people would complain all the time that they stunk live, but the reason they stunk apparently is they were too loud, too fast, and they're just like, playing it punk. They're like going hard. And everybody likes that. They want them to lay back and sing their harmonies and stuff. And I'm like, there's none of this is recorded. None of this live, nothing live was recorded by them before 67, which is utter bummer because I bet you they were great. So somehow Miles Davis heard them and said, "Hey, you want a Beatles style group? There's this one in LA that's kicking up a fuss." And so they auditioned and were accepted, and they put together this arrangement of Mr. Tambourine Man. But legendarily, of course, they didn't play on it mostly. It was them singing with McGuinn playing guitar. But that was such a huge hit that, of course, in those days you get to record an album, and they recorded one of the great debuts of the '60s. What did you think listening to this record?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's awesome all the way
It's
through for
stunning.
sure.
It's like
Yeah,
crazy. And
yeah,
when you
yeah.
compare it to early '65, what the Stones and the Beatles were doing, which was still putting covers on their records, their songs were good for what they were, but this contained nothing but either Gene Clark or Bird songs or Dylan songs, and all done in this original style. And you can listen to it and hear that it had an immediate impact on everybody. Plus the coolest. They are the
Yeah.
coolest, man. Look at that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like they're way
And
cooler
some
than any of those other dudes.
right, and some of the Dylan songs given to them, right? It wasn't they weren't songs that he had recorded first, or were. I
Well,
mean,
some of them, it was mix. They would get
uh-huh.
demos, but I think he'd recorded Mr. Tambourine Man, right?
Right,
And
right.
but he had not gone electric at all yet. Like he went electric because of the
Right.
Byrds. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, there's quotes from him saying basically, McGuinn taught me how to sing rock, sing my material in a rock style. Because when you think about folk, a lot of it is that up and down two beat or three waltzes. Whereas the big shift for the Byrds is putting it on that boom boom bap boom 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 bap sort of feel. And Michael Clark's very jazzy drummer. He's not like, I wouldn't call him Keith Moon or something like that, or Mitch Mitchell, but he's a deceptively good drummer. He's got really good feel and he swings like crazy and he's very, very jazzy. So that gives them kind of a cool, distinctive feel as well. And so they cook all the way through this record. The only song, I think, Mr. Tambourine Man and whatever the B side to that was, I can't be arsed to look in the moment, are the only ones with session people on it. All the rest of it is the original Byrds just cracking it out in the studio.
I knew I'd
Um,
want you. Is that the B side?
I knew I'd want you. Yeah, that's the other
Yeah.
one with,
Mm-hmm.
I think, Hal
Mm-hmm.
Blaine plays drums on that or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Larry
Yeah.
Knechtel at that crew.
Uh-huh.
And but the rest of it is all the Byrds. And the rest of the catalog pretty much is always the Byrds. Like there's this, people kind of think that, especially this album, it's all Wrecking Crew or something. It's just not the case. And it's sort of a weird reputation. And Michael Clark, so this first album, the thing I always want to salvage is Michael Clark's reputation, because even the other Byrds sometimes will be like, oh, he's terrible. His drum arrangements are nuts. And he hits the drums really hard, and he is kind of a glue groove wise that really holds that band together. And he and Hillman are very good together. But so what did you think listening to this record coming to it?
Well, that's interesting that I never would have had a problem with the drums. I mean, I thought the drumming is really good on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, right.
That's an interesting one not to have had the context while I'm listening to it, that somebody would complain, because it would never have occurred to me that anybody would
They
think the
stand
drums
out
were.
a little bit, the
Yeah,
drums.
yeah, yeah. I think so
That's
too. I
good.
mean, I Feel a Whole Lot Better is the song I always loved from them from the beginning, and it's still basically my all-time favorite song of theirs, even though
Yeah,
I've
oh
liked a
yeah.
lot, but it just contains everything about them that I really like, and it's fast, and it's, yeah, that song is amazing. But the whole thing is like, I mean, it feels like a greatest hits in a weird way. Even not
Yeah,
not that, but like it's kind of like a meaty beady big and bouncy or something like that. It just has that flow that everything hits all the way
it
through.
right, right. And I
Mhm.
think that makes it distinctive from albums from that era, which could be really choppy because they had to do other things. They weren't necessarily ever about being an album. And I would say that this album is a key part in the advancement of the album because I guess because they had the number one hit, that gave them a little bit more freedom, or because their vibe was, hip already, they were sort of able to do something a little different. And the Gene Clark songs are all a little heavy. Like there's not a lot of super bright stuff on here, and which is interesting. And it doesn't seem pitched to teeny boppers quite as much. It does seem a pitch to heads and older people a little bit, adults. And you can see the straight line from this to say Rubber Soul, like it's like immediate. The other thing about I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better is how many people ripped off that lick for that song and wrote songs around it. That
Right,
do do
right.
do 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 do
Uh-huh.
over and
Uh-huh.
over. Like you listen to the '60s from that point forward, every single band is had
Uh-huh.
a go at that. It's like the Satisfaction lick, same thing.
Right.
It's they
Right.
just
Uh-huh.
everywhere.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's one of the great songs of
Classic.
all time. I just unstoppable,
Yeah, it's just
unstoppable.
yep,
And
totally.
so pretty quickly they from Turn, which is the next thing,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they had put out a couple singles in the meantime that weren't successful, but they kind of stayed in the public eye, but they needed another number one hit, and so they kind of struggled a bit, like whether should we do another Dylan song, and so eventually. McGuinn remembered this thing that he had done with somebody else, Pete Seeger song, Turn. Jim Dixon, who was still advising him at the time, was mad. He goes, "If you do this and go to number one, you'll never have another number one again," which is a funny thing to warn somebody about. But
Right.
he was right. Bless him. They never had another one, but it's a pretty good one. So they kind of started the year with a number one and ended the year with a number one and another really, really good record that, again, I think showed that they were in many ways way more mature than a lot of the other artists at the time, stepping up their game. Um, a lot of the songs on here are crazy. Set You Free This Time, uh,
Mhm.
you know, If You're Gone, Wait and
Yeah, I mean
See. I
all
like the
those
stuff
are
like Oh Susanna.
yeah, and all the Clark songs on here. So there's only three
They're
of them, I
so
guess, but
good.
they're really good. Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because the record before was released in June, and this is December, so
Yeah,
just a few months.
that was their contract. That's what I was
Yeah,
saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And for it to
Hmm.
be this good. And you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
totally tell
totally.
those guys like the Beatles and the Stones are like, ooh,
Hmm.
oops. I mean the
Right.
But they've made everybody got to make good records. Like the Stones are putting out like Aftermath around this time, which is a really good
Hmm.
record. And the
Hmm.
Beatles went from Rubber Soul to Revolver during this time period,
Right.
plainly kind of
Hmm.
responsive to
Hmm.
this. But at this point, during the promotion for this record, they were supposed to go to New York, and they got on a plane to do it. And Gene Clark freaked out. And in those days, they would medicate people to try and get them to chill out. So I don't know whether
Right.
somebody had said, "Here, have some acid; it'll make the plane ride better," or whether he just really was, because he was like this. He'd witnessed a plane crash. He was always kind of a nervous guy, and he'd already had trouble traveling in the New Christie Minstrels. It had been difficult for him to do travel. Kind of high strung, probably undiagnosed mental illness, which those days would just be chalked up to
Sure.
him
Yeah.
being moody or something. And so he got off the plane, and that pretty much was the end of him being officially in the Byrds anymore, and reduced them to a four-piece, uh, sort of at their peak. But I also, it's hard not to be sympathetic to somebody who's suffering from anxiety, who's having trouble with the schedule, who isn't sure it's what they ever wanted to do anyway. You know, to be a teeny bopper star flying all over the country is very stressful and stupid. And the Byrds were always ambivalent towards it. Famously, they were kind of also the first band to be sort of grumpy. Like they
Right.
literally would just openly smoke pot everywhere they went. They just walk around in a haze of cigarettes and pot. Somebody has a tab ass, they're like, yeah, sure, let's go. Like they were the first band like that to be just openly that way. And I think that ambivalence, probably went all over the map. You have Crosby, who really wants to be a star, plainly, and then you have Gene Clark, who likes writing songs and likes singing and that kind of thing, but maybe isn't so crazy about traveling all over the country, getting in people's faces. So Clark quits, but not before starting to write, or basically writing 8 Miles High, which we spoke about, as a lot of people misinterpret that song, although it is definitely psychedelic. It's a song about anxiety, and it's a song about the difficulty of coping with the change going on around you. It's a song about being in unfamiliar territory with not feeling, stable. And that is a signal probably to how he felt about the Byrds in a lot of ways, because it's not a triumphant song. Here we are in England. It's pretty
Right.
much like, oh, I'm in a tin can flying really
Mhm.
high. Um, but it also is absolutely one of the very first psychedelic songs entirely. I can't think of really one before then. And they also would put little hints in, like Gene Clark in a couple songs used the word trip, which sometimes they would censor that on other
Oh,
records
wow.
because it was considered to be
Uh-huh.
such an overt drug reference,
Uh-huh.
and
Wow.
he'd be like, I'm on your trip or you're on my trip kind of thing.
Mhm.
So 8 Miles High, very overt. But
Uh-huh.
it led to, of course, my absolute favorite Byrds album,
Mhm.
Fifth Dimension. So this album, probably one of the first sort of psychedelic experience records, I think, like just my take on it. Because the song Fifth Dimension, although it's about physics, is very trippy. Let's be honest. The words without a doubt apply to that. 8 Miles High, but also the way the album's put together is interesting. Like, without having any of the Gene Clark songs, they had to get really eclectic with the material, and it leads to this, I think, a really interesting album experience. I hate to pick a favorite, but if I'm gonna push comes to shove, this is the one I put on the most because there's so many different things on it. I think the band's at a peak sound wise, and I love the sound of the album. It's got this real satisfying crunch to it. Like, it's heavy. It
Right.
really is heavier. Like, it's closer to maybe what their live sound was. Like,
Mhm.
what did you think of listening to it? Because it's a strange
Yeah,
album, kind
that's
of.
yeah, I feel that same the heaviness of it you get right away, definitely. And I mean, I guess partially because of the first three, it's got the least stuff that they didn't write. Right. It's got no Dylan on it, which and
No
so
Dylan,
it
right?
kind of yeah, and it's kind of all theirs in a way that more so than the first couple records. And also this direction they were going in is pretty. I mean, it saturates every track, the kind of heaviness and the yeah,
It's
no. I mean, it's doesn't sound like a record that was necessarily like we got to churn out a lot of hits kind of record.
no,
Yeah.
no. The two singles were heavy. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
5D is crazy. The lyrics to that, and yet
Hmm.
it's catchy. It's like
Yeah.
it was a single. I mean, top 20 or something
Hmm.
like that. Good on them.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
you can tell the Velvet Underground, for instance, listen to this album quite a bit. Like, just the sound of it. One of my favorite things is if you listen to the stereo version, particularly the Learjet song, they've done a hard separation between the Learjet sounds, which is it's an instrumental with them going, "You ride the Learjet, Learjet," while it literally is the sound of the engine revving and the guys talking on the radio. That's all in one channel. Then there's the instrumental kind of stuff in the other. And you could, if you do, you just like The Gift, like it sounds just like it. And even the sound of the band sounds a lot like The Gift. And I could also see both Cale and Reed being really interested in those songs with the strings, where you've got the band crunching. That's another one where on the stereo, it's a hard separation and you can just turn it over and just listen to the band crunch
Right.
away. And then
Hmm.
the other side, you hear the strings and vocals, which is also stunning. Like, you
Right.
could do it.
Totally.
It's like incredible. And I could see those guys really paying attention to that. That I don't know that any other band. I'm trying to think of another band that did the strings thing as well as they did during that period. I don't think anybody even really tried. Like, when Love did the strings thing, it was some of the songs just had strings, right? Like, the strings dominated. It wasn't really a blend. Like, the strings in this really are right in there with the band. John Riley also is gorgeous. The way the strings work on that one.
No, it's just amazing to me how short the songs are. They don't feel that short. It's
Hmm.
like what they're able to pack into. I mean, Mr. Spaceman's barely 2 minutes, and
Yeah.
I mean, they sound freer than 2 and 3 minute songs would normally sound. I think.
Well, that's kind of what I mean. Is like it's interesting how it adds up as an album. Like, if you took all of those different parts, you may not think of it as an album. like if I just explained it to you, and yet somehow when you drop the needle at one side of it and pick it up at the end, you're like, oh, that was a real experience. It really
Right,
works in that way.
right. Uh-huh.
Um, and I think it's interesting. So during this time period, basically they didn't freak out at all. They're like, oh, okay, Gene's gone. Guess we got to make a record, kind of thing. And they made a record, and so Gene's gone. In the meantime, Gene was writing a bunch of songs and starting to put together a record and a band, and we'll get to that because it is kind of tied to 5D and their next album, Younger Than Yesterday. But the songs, it's interesting to contemplate what these records would have been like with the Gene Clark songs on them, like how that might have changed them or not. I think it's interesting that member left, and then they made what I consider to be their best record, which I would not have guessed.
Right.
But
Because it's not like you don't like Gene
it's
Clark.
yeah, right. I love them. Yeah, right. And the other thing I'll say about this is another. They are secretly really influential. Like I think that the bands they were really influential on the other musicians that were just slightly more popular than them. And as they go along, you can kind of hear that a lot of those guys are, especially the British bands, are paying a lot of attention to the Byrds. Literally, what they do, move to move. They're always interested and think they're cool. And Bob Dylan as well. So they made a transition around this time from being the Teen Balfour band with the #1 singles to being like the first with the Velvet Underground, kind of underground band. So they became sort of something that was more associated with the Velvet Underground or Frank Zappa, that kind of vibe, very early on also. So they went from being like one of the first American breakthrough bands to being one of the first bands to be this kind of undergroundy, trippy, drug connotations kind of band, like in a year. Like, what are we talking here?
Right.
And it just things went so much faster then.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, and I like how that's part of this record without it being like thrown in your face kind of concept. I like as much as I like the Beatles records, some of their records could be like, hey, look, we went out and did drugs, and you're gonna know about all of how trippy and conceptual and everything we're doing is. And this is just sort of packaged straightforward, pretty. It doesn't throw a bunch of concepts in your face, but it's clearly,
it's trippy as fuck.
influenced by, yeah, exactly.
It's dripping, it's got trails.
Yeah.
Because these guys, I think, were a little more experienced actually with psychedelics for longer. So the Beatles started taking them in '65, and immediately, they're in the throes of being stars. These guys,
Right.
when most of them started taking this stuff, they weren't stars at all. So their mentality there's just no way that wouldn't affect you a little bit.
Right. Right.
And
Totally.
so they've also just had a few more years under their belts. They probably even did peyote or mushrooms and, a wide variety of psychedelic things. So it's already just baked into the first record's psychedelic as hell. It's that way I said that going for that drone is psychedelic. They all knew about Indian music and the connections between, say, Appalachian music and Indian music and blues and stuff. That folk scene was all about that stuff. So that drone is deliberate, and that drone really comes to the forward in Fifth Dimension too. Just it's like this real distorted thing though. But it's like,
Yeah.
and this is we talked about this with the Maasais when they had their little press conference with the sitar and the John Coltrane and stuff. But it was a huge advancement at that time, particularly just being like, I'm gonna solo like Coltrane. Like everybody's like, wait, what? It was different. Like nobody else was doing that. And I'm sure Lou himself felt very vindicated when he's hearing this going, oh, I've been doing this. Does that make sense? And
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
Totally.
and I'm sure even somebody maybe who's listening to Jimi Hendrix would be doing the same thing, if that makes sense. Next album after Fifth Dimension, Younger Than Yesterday.
Right.
Yay. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, I like it. I have to admit, it's not necessarily one of my favorite ones.
Oh, interesting.
There's a couple songs on it that I think are, obviously the first few are great. And there's nothing bad on it, but it didn't quite hit me as much as the first, the ones that preceded it. I'm not 100% sure why.
Second favorite. This one
really
might be my second favorite. I adore it. I love this one too. I love CTA with all the weird noises.
Yeah, that's great.
I love Everybody's Been Burned. I think all the Chris Hillman songs like Time Between stuff are really good. I think this one hits 100% for
It's
me.
funny now that you're
Um,
mentioning all the songs. It's like I do like all the songs, so maybe I need to
right?
hear this one again now in a
I even
row
like
because there
Mind
are
Garden. Everybody
great songs.
trashes Mind Gardens, but I like Mind
Mm-hmm.
Gardens. But
Uh-huh.
that's because I'm a freak, noisenick.
Uh-huh.
But people
Great.
call that
That's cool.
self-indulgent. That's one of the things that
Mm-hmm.
Rogan trashes in his books. But I think it's really cool. And I
Uh-huh.
don't, again, way more out there than anything anybody else had put on record, except for maybe the VU at that point. So
Right,
that
right.
already is way ahead of the game. At the time, they
Mm-hmm.
were also working on a version of Miles Davis song Milestones that they would play live. So they
Oh,
had this
wow.
drony modal version of that sort of to
Mm-hmm.
repay. They wanted
Mm-hmm.
to thank him for getting them on the label.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they would play that live sometimes. So they were very serious. And I think that as they go forward, if you listen to the later version of the band, this jazz rock thing, that is a thread that goes through everything, in part because of Michael Clark, but also I think Roger McGuinn like the idea of them interacting like a jazz band, no matter what kind of music they were playing. And so that's why Michael Clark was perfect for them, first part of their career. And just the band conception changed to a very fluid one in the second part so that they could accommodate that. And Clarence White, very jazzy player, but we'll get to that. Now, this is the first record that their future bird, Clarence White, appears on. He's on a couple of tracks. If you know where to listen for him, you hear him right away. So at the same time this came out, literally the same day, I was talking about Gene Clark writing tunes. His solo album, Gene Clark with the Gosden Brothers, came out. This album is insanely great. It's just unbelievable LA 60s, pop in the like it's pretty much a Byrds album. It's got Chris Hillman playing bass, it's got Michael Clark playing drums, it's got
Mm-hmm.
Glenn Campbell and Clarence White on guitars, which already makes it one of the best bands of all time. But
Right.
some of the songs on here are crazy good. And I listened to this, I'm like, it's just a couple of these on those two albums would have been pretty cool.
Right,
Elevator
right.
Operator, I love that. Tried So Hard. I think I'm going to feel better. Um, there's so many good songs on here. The same one. This is a great off the beaten track thing to check out for the Byrds. It's basically a Byrds album. It just lacks McGuinn because it's a Gene Clark record. But as far as the sound and the feel, it's mid 60s Byrds all the way. The quality of the songs is super high. And we'll get into it a little bit, but later on, people who played on this album, Chris Hillman and Clarence White, loved these songs so much that they brought them back and played them in groups later. Particularly Tried So Hard and Think I'm Going to Feel Better, but we'll see that later. But that album, of course, sank without a trace, went nowhere, and Gene Clark, being the fussy sort, couldn't really keep a band together to play, didn't have the attention span or desire. I think he might have been happier just writing songs and having people buy them. Maybe that would have been better for him, but I think people kind of were like, hey, you're cute, you should be out in front. I think, in that, and add in genuine mental health issues, which would appear more as his life went on. Um, he just didn't have a shot. Some of these guys just weren't, I don't think, mentally able to handle the rigors of this kind of business. Famously, McGuinn's attitude was let it be. It happens, it happens. And he was the leader of the Byrds, but the way he led was, I'm not doing anything. It just happens, it unfolds. And it's true. And so he would it was the right thing to do, but it would sometimes lead to issues like maybe a stronger leader would have found a way to get Gene Clark to still be involved more heavily, just to have that material flowing in, because later on they really struggled for songs. Um, so it's a kind of a weird time for them there. They start fighting with Crosby a lot. And during some, like, there are literal physical fistfights in the Byrds background. Early session, Crosby refused to sing a song, so Jim Dixon literally tackled him to the ground and sat on him. They're both like, and he's like 6'2" or something, and Crosby sat there throwing a tantrum like a baby until he would sing the song. And Michael Clark at one time just got so sick of Crosby running his mouth that he just literally gets up from his chair, walks around the drums, walks up to Crosby, punches him in the mouth, turns around, sits back down at the drums, goes, "Man, I've been dying to do that."
Wow.
So there was a weird, then they were filming something on a beach where they got into like three or four of them got into some sort of fracas. So it's kind of weird. Like there's all this undercurrent of violence with them, which again, you listen to the music and you think, oh, and you see Roger McGuinn, you think, oh, it's very placid. But some of those guys were really kind of weirdly violent, like punchy, you know, and so they had this. We looking back, they look like something just this side of the Mamas and the Papas in some ways, but in reality, even at the time, they read much more edgy than that, and they
Hmm.
were genuinely more edgy than
Right.
that, you know.
Right. And they were probably
Um,
at this point spending like 24/7 with each other, basically. I mean, with all the work they had to do and everything, right?
yeah, but the other thing is they were kind of friends anyway. Like they're definitely a band as we see people drop off. So Gene Clark, um, they all still hung out with Gene Clark. Like Chris Hillman and Michael Clark on this record, you know, and Gene Clark would go over to Roger McGuinn's house and they'd chill. And um, there's this weird thing about people would leave the Byrds even in a huff, but they don't seem to go very far. You know, there's always
Right.
birds around other birds. It's really interesting. And they
Hmm.
were genuinely kind of a weirdly fractious group, but somehow they were also kind of a social group that stayed together. And so, but the Crosby, during this time period, Crosby started getting really annoying, as Crosby does, and he's a bit of a star fucker, being David Crosby, and he started hanging out more with bands like the Buffalo Springfield and Jefferson Airplane. And I think he saw the Byrds a little bit as little old hat. You know, they'd had their time. Their Beatle copying days are numbered. I'm hanging out with the Beatles now. I shouldn't be copying the Beatles, you know. And maybe he wasn't wrong. I don't know, but he's such a dick about stuff. So they started recording their next album, and he was just a nonstop prick about stuff. Wouldn't stop, just arguing everything to the ground. There's this one song called Triad that's on a lot of extra stuff, and
All
it's
right.
basically about a threesome. And when he sings it, it's disgusting. It's like disgusting. It's awful. And I can imagine the other
Uh-huh.
birds going, no, no, you're not putting this on a record. He ended up giving it to Grace Slick, who sang it.
I was gonna
And when
say that
Grace
was on
Slick,
Jefferson Airplane record, right?
when
Yeah,
Grace
yeah.
Slick sings it, totally different. Like it got a completely different vibe, also because she's great. She's got her own way of handling it. But it's like Crosby sometimes doesn't process things like that, you know. And they got in a big argument over one of the Carole King songs on Notorious Bird Brothers, which is one of the masterpieces on there. I think I don't think it wasn't Born to Follow, maybe. And they apparently he left the studio in a huff, so Hillman and McGuinn drove up to his house and they're like, "Man, you're out of the band, dude." And so he had a cry about it, and then they went back to business, and so they finished up the next album, which is Notorious Bird Brothers, which is, I think, a masterpiece. I think that's one of the great psychedelic records of the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, I
Beautiful.
love this record. I definitely
And
love this record. It's
it's
great.
completely different from 5D, for instance, or from Younger
Hmm.
Than Yesterday, which are both very heavy rhythmic records. This one is light as air, like, and gorgeous, right? It just hovers there. And like so this is a very sort of unsung album. People don't really talk about this album a lot. I mean, I would put it up there with, but beyond Sergeant Pepper's or something like that, as far as quality,
Hmm.
stem to stern. What did you think of it coming to it?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, and I do think that the thing you say about being light, which is interesting because there are so many people on it. I mean, it's
Right.
got a massive amount of different orchestration, or I guess you would call it, or just instrumentation.
Yeah,
But I don't think
they
that's,
augmented. Yeah,
yeah, but I think they do it in a way that doesn't get in the way. I mean, it still feels, it doesn't feel crowded. I
right.
don't think, which is pretty cool. And there's just some classics. I mean, there's just some songs on here that are just. I mean, Artificial Energy is great. Going Back is great. Old John Robertson. I mean, there's just a
They're
lot of
all
really good songs on
every
here.
song. And you
Yeah.
get to the end of it, and you're like, is that's it?
Yeah.
I have to admit, this record,
Yeah.
I really do. It gets the end of Space
Uh-huh.
Odyssey. I'm like, oh, I
Uh-huh.
have this really funny theory about Artificial Energy, is that I think
Mhm.
that the Velvet Underground heard that and wrote Sister Ray in response.
I
And
could totally
because
see
I
that.
found a
Yeah.
quote someplace where they called it Sister Ray a drug song parody. And I don't know why, but then I started thinking about this song and the way it ends and everything like that, and the Velvet
Uh-huh.
Underground both being knocked out and annoyed by that a little bit,
Right.
you know, and being like, wait,
Uh-huh.
wait, wait, wait a second, this is our turf a bit
Right.
too,
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah,
coming up with
totally.
Sister Ray because it's around the same time.
Hmm. that totally makes sense.
It's a
Um,
good time though to talk maybe about producers because this one's produced by Gary Usher. I'm putting this up the wrong way. But so Gary Usher, I thought you're right, did a really good job on this record of blending. It's obvious they wanted to do something a little more adventurous with blending orchestral sounds with the music in a very natural way, and they
mhm,
really did nail it. Like
right.
it's seamless.
Hmm.
Definitely a high point for everybody.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's funny the CD. So I have the CD box, which is the ones I've been holding up, the box of all the, and it's got these bonus
The
tracks.
bonus tracks are
Let's
great.
see, which are
Yes.
amazing. And in a way, I mean, there's Triad on there too, but
Yeah.
but all in a weird way. I mean, their album's only a half hour long. They could have included some of the other songs, although I don't know if it would have worked as well as an album if they had.
Right.
But
No, I mean, it does
you
look
know,
like that's where
yeah.
Usher made a really good decision to make something that
Mhm.
flowed rather than
Right.
just loading it up,
Hmm.
you know.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, but it was the breaking of the band basically. Although the first time that you can actually find live Byrds recordings from the earliest part of their careers when they toured as a three-piece with Michael Clark and Chris Hillman and Roger McGuinn. I think it sounds amazing. I was just like, why didn't they keep doing this? It's like heavy and they
Right.
cook, really jazzy. They go out and jam. And McGuinn, of course, has all this room to roam, and he's a great, wonderful guitarist. Um, and so it's kind of like an era that's really cool. But part of it is Hillman and McGuinn in particular, they knew they were up for a new contract with Columbia. So if they made a record that sold, that meant that they could get a little more money. I think there was a little bit of Hillman like trying to close the deal, and maybe Hillman would then go do something else, and McGuinn would keep going with the Byrds, which is ultimately what happened. But so they finished this record. It did okay, but not as well as they thought it would. But what was put out around the same time is the Byrds' greatest hits,
Right.
probably one
Right.
of the great albums of the 60s, really, if you're being
Yeah.
honest. And
Right. And the record
sold
that
a butt
everybody
ton,
has.
but
Yeah.
sold a whole lot.
Mhm.
Just Deathless, not a bad
Mhm.
track on here, straight up.
Right.
Just so good.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, what can you say about that?
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
not
it's
in
pretty
that. Did they
amazing to
put
have
that
it.
in the box set? I can't remember.
No, it's not in the box
Yeah.
set. But I mean, I mean, how long have they been a band at this point?
Two,
Three
two and a
years
half
or
years, three
yeah,
years.
which is it's amazing to have a greatest hits. I
That's a
mean, and
real greatest hits
we're
too.
talking about a ton, yeah, and we're talking about a ton of records for that small period of time, but still it's really amazing to have a greatest hits record that
And I
quickly.
mean, it's one of the greatest
It works
hits.
so well.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
It's just so solid. And I mean,
Hmm.
it really is just the A sides and the B sides, which is crazy too, for the most part.
Uh-huh.
It's like
Yeah,
not monkeyed with. It doesn't have a special album
right.
track that everybody loves, particularly. It's all
Hmm.
just the singles. And
Right.
just incredible.
Hmm.
So then what
We'll go to
happens?
this one.
Yes. My least favorite Birds album, I think, just about.
Yeah,
So they get
yeah,
Graham Parsons because they wanted somebody to play piano because he wanted to go in a jazzier direction. So I think McGuinn wanted to have a piano player, bassist, 12 string drums, and jazz up and improvise around Bird songs live and stuff like that, and maybe see what kind of direction. His next idea for an album was to have a double album that basically was kind of like a song in each style of American music he could come up with. So like I think even like ragtime and swing jazz or whatever. It's kind of a corny idea, but it sort of when you think about that and then you think about the Byrds, you're like, well, it seems like that's a little bit of a concept. Like, what can I lay my 12 string into? Like he gets restless for material since he doesn't really write a lot of his own. He's like, what if I try this like that? Oh, what if I try this?
right. Yeah,
And
it's not a crazy idea in a
no,
way,
no, it's
but
great. It drives the
yeah.
Byrds. It can. I think that
Hmm.
is the times that the Byrds are at their worst is when they get away from Roger McGuinn doing his 12 string thing and singing. That's when they aren't really clicking like that. And it doesn't matter what the material is. It doesn't matter anything else. Just that he's involved somehow, and that gives it that particular sound, that drone that makes it carry through the thread. And he's on. I mean, he really is. We don't think about it. What a singer! What a guitar player! Like
Yeah. Oh,
there's
incredible.
nothing he
Yeah, I
can't
mean, it's guitar
sing.
playing.
His guitar playing is nuts. He's a complete innovator, way ahead of the game. The sound he had on his 12 string was different and created. It's an electronic sound. He was obsessed with gadgets, so it's not just him strumming a 12 string. First, it was him maxing out an amp, to the best of his ability. When he got in the studio, they were fooling around, and there's a compressor that they used, I think a hand-built compressor at the time, that they would compress his 12 string and then EQ it. And so that's why it has a really distinctive sound that's almost rhythmic and gets that they probably tune the compressor so that it fluctuates with the drone sound. And that is his sound. So eventually he went back to Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker built that compressor into his guitars. So he has a special Roger McGuinn guitar that has that built already in there because he's a gadget guy. Like they did that Learjet song because they knew the Learjet guy and were obsessed with Learjets. Roger McGuinn has Moog number 1 or 2. It's hard to tell. It's him or Mickey Dolenz. Like he's got like the earliest Moog, whatever we say now.
Moog, whatever.
And
Yeah.
so he's a gadget guy, and that's another thing about the Byrds that's interesting. Even though they're kind of a folk group and come from that very traditional folk thing, there's a forward-thinking thing going on with them. There's the songs about Mr. Spaceman, which were very sincere, songs about stars and physics and things like that, that it keeps them from being the fucking Eagles or something like that. You know what I mean? Like there's a mind at work there that isn't just about selling records. It's a mind that's trying to solve, bring philosophy or ideas to what you're doing to give it depth. So that mind was turned off for this record by my lights. Although there's stuff on here I actually kind of like that would fit in well with other Byrds records. The overall effect to me is I find it very boring. I think it's like bad country played badly. It's played by people who can't play country. And the Byrds did better with country when they didn't try to play country. They just let it be, them playing country as the Byrds rather than the Byrds playing country. And I can't argue with this record because it's been so influential and people do love it. And there is good stuff on there and some great Graham Parsons songs on here. I find a lot of stuff. There's a couple things in particular in the bonus tracks that I think better than anything on the record. Like that song Reputation is really good, and their version of Lazy Days, which was later done by the Flying Burrito Brothers, is really good. I think it's a lazy day, and it's got impetus, which this album lacks a little bit. My favorite tracks on here though are 100 years from now. I love that one. Hickory Wind is of course great. I really like the two Dylan songs, particularly Nothing Was Delivered. The lyrics to that just never fail to make me chuckle because it pretty much sounds like he's just writing a letter to somebody who didn't give him something he paid for, but it's got this great
Right.
vibe to it.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
that I like that stuff. And they,
Mm-hmm.
I just think they went overboard on the concept. There's not enough Roger McGuinn on it at all. Like there's more
Mm-hmm.
there's more steel guitar than there is Roger
Right.
McGuinn
Yeah,
in a lot of
there's
ways.
pedal steel, multiple pedal steel on most tracks,
Right.
I
And
think.
it's
Yeah, yeah.
that drummer, usually I like the Byrds drummers. This particular drummer, Kevin
Mm-hmm.
Kelly, I don't think is quite up to it. He's a little
Mm-hmm.
dry. He doesn't have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
drive.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, fuck him.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much was my same reaction to this album. I mean, I understand why it's influential and I understand what they were going for. It just, I don't know, like you say, it feels more forced, a little more conceptually like we're doing something. It's like the difference between aiming and throwing. They're aiming
Right, it
here,
is.
sort of,
Now,
and
if you
not,
want to
and
give him credit, maybe it's the first genre exercise like that. I have to admit now that I rack my brain, I can't think of any other major band being like, well, now we're going to do a country album. Nobody done anything like that. And there was, I think, rightfully a big wall at that point between country and the rest of the music because I mean, I have my own feelings about country, but it's usually retrograde, not a forward thinking kind of music at all. And I don't think Roger McGuinn really ever intended to go that deep into it, but his leadership style is, let's just see what happens. And there's one funny quote where he says that he wanted a piano player, but then George Jones jumped out, and that is what happened to the Byrds. And there also might be a sense that he realized pretty quickly that Graham Parsons was going to go through the band, and he just let him go through the band. He kind of just let it. He's like, okay, this is happening right now. I can sense it's going to stop. He'll keep going, and so we'll just deal with that. And I guess what the approximate cause was that They were in England and they were supposed to do a tour of South Africa because they had been friends with some South African musicians who told them, you should at least give it a try. Maybe the time a lot of the European bands were boycotting South Africa a bit, and South Africa also sucked. It was like a very backwards. They didn't like rock and roll there. They were very annoyed with it anyway. And so Graham Parsons was like, I'm not going to South Africa. I'm too good for that. And so he stayed back and hung out with the Stones. And so the Byrds were stuck cobbling together again, contracts. You got to fulfill the contract. You signed it, you're going to have to pay. So somebody has to go. So basically they cobbled together a band, went, and it sucked. And then they came back, and Hillman at that point quit the group, leaving McGuinn kind of by himself. McGuinn decided to keep it going with Clarence White in particular, who had played on a couple records already, had played with Gene Clark, was very close to the band, had already almost joined, I think, when Crosby quit, because he's on every record from Younger Than Yesterday now. You can kind of hear him. Once you start listening, you're like, oh, he's on that track. I can hear him. And so it was a natural thing for him to bring, and he brought his friend Gene Parsons in. They'd been in a band together called Nashville West, which was a very early country rock combo. And the first bassist they got was a guy named John York, who good singer, kind of bland, but works well in this context. And that album, they put together an album with Dylan's producer Bob Johnston called Dr. Byrds and Mr. Hyde.
Right.
I like this
Which
one.
I think it's really good. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I something about, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't, but I kind of love this cover.
Oh, I
I
think the
like
cover's great.
the
Yeah, and the
font is
back with
awesome,
the
and
horses and
yeah,
everything, it's so
yeah,
goofy and
yeah,
cool. Look at the
yeah.
effort they went to for covers back then.
Right, right. And this one is sort of a different character than any of the others, and yeah, I just
Yeah, it's got a
and
different sound.
it fits. Yeah, the fact that it looks so different than their other records fits with some of the way it sounds different from their other records, and
Right. But
yeah, this is sort of what like a hidden gem kind of album. It feels
it
like.
is, it is, yes, very
Yeah.
much so.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
do love, like I was saying about the technology and everything. Look how they wrote Birds,
Right.
right?
Uh-huh.
So like a
And
computer style,
that like
seeing the
early
Birds as
computer
the
font. Yeah.
spacemen, and then Mr.
Yeah.
Hyde. I bet the whole thing
Uh-huh.
falls apart because you're like, Dr. Birds and Mr. Hyde. Was Mr. Hyde a cowboy? Or
Right.
I'm confused. So
Right, right.
it's kind of cool though.
Uh-huh.
And the version of Wheels on Fire with the super fuzzed out Clarence White going off of a
Yeah,
fuzzed out guitar. I absolutely
that's
love
amazing
that.
to start an album with too. Is
Yeah.
really awesome.
All
Mhm.
of I think every song on here is pretty cool. I guess they aren't the best
Mhm.
blues band in the world, which kind of is the end of the album. But
All right.
everything else, I like the light psychedelic songs like Candy and
Mhm.
Child of the Universe is really good.
Right, that one's great. Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, I think this is really a cool, interesting, surprising. I didn't expect this one to be as good as it ended up being when I listened to it, because I just had never heard that much about it. I mean, I guess it doesn't really have as big a reputation as a lot of their records,
It
right?
doesn't have a big hit single on it,
Right.
particularly,
Hmm.
And so at
Hmm.
this point, their commercial prospects are pretty low. They have now
Hmm.
firmly an underground band.
Right.
Although they sold records, comparatively, they're top 40, top 30 kind of band. But they are no longer bumping out number one hit singles, particularly. I don't even know if they're doing singles, particularly, or they've kind of gone to being more an album band in a lot of ways. And you can see that, and they try to have a little bit of a concept for the albums as it is. Now, this album, it does relate very much. It also is super eclectic and relates a lot to how McGuinn was talking about doing all these different kinds of music, because they do touch on the blues. There's psychedelic songs. There's the heavy fuzzed out songs. And so that does seem to be having a mobile band that can play almost any kind of music while still honoring a particular sound seems to be the direction he wants to go in. Clarence White, of course, is a genius and unbelievable. And every one of his solos is better than any guitar solo you've ever heard in your life. And it's like listening to them a lot, like listening to them live. He's like Charlie Parker. Like you could just sit there and make something of just Clarence White solos, and it would just astonish you from solo to solo to solo to solo. The B bender. So he and Gene Parsons invented the B bender guitar, which is they take a Telecaster, they make a spring attachment with the strap to the B string, and he can pull on it and make that steel guitar sound. But in his hands, as soon as he started doing it, it's like a other thing entirely, you know. Like at first he would do it on sessions, but he wouldn't show anybody the guitar. He'd like quickly pull it in and out of his case so nobody could see. They couldn't see the back of it, which had all this mechanical stuff on it. And so eventually he made a couple, and I think like Marty Stewart has one of his guitars right now, but it's an actual mechanical thing where you pull on the strap, it pulls a spring and bends the string, so that's how you get that particular sound that he gets. But he's so nimble. His hand-eye coordination must just be astonishing. The stuff he plays, and he plays in a pick and roll style, which means he's using his fingers and a pick kind of thing. And his harmonic sophistication is way up there. He seems to make anything work through any series of chords. And now the Byrds start getting recorded live a lot. There's a live album from this tour, from the Fillmore or something like that. That's excellent. So now they're a really, really good live band, like shocking, like mind bending. Where before they were a band that everybody complained about as being laissez-faire. I read a review of one of their three-piece shows where the guy writing the review is like, well, two of the members were on acid and the other one was sitting there with a whiskey bottle. And then they went on stage and they sounded great, but that's like the review. And so now they are a well-oiled machine. Clarence White, extremely experienced musician, had been playing live since childhood. And he and Gene Parsons had been in bands together forever. So it really clicked. John York is he's a good player, so the band sounds good, but he would leave, I think, after or during the next record, which is Easy Rider, which is another sneaky masterpiece in my mind. What did you think of this one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like it as much as the Mr. Hyde one, but it's definitely good. It's definitely really good, and also surprising. I mean, I don't think I even knew this existed until I got this box set, which is weird because, I mean, just the Easy Rider connection you would think would be enough to have made it a famous
Well, at the
record.
time,
But
this was their commercial comeback. So
okay.
in
Hmm.
between Dr. Byrds and Mr. Hyde, they made Easy Rider was made, and I don't know if anybody watched the film recently. What it would immediately realize that Peter Fonda is Roger McGuinn and Dennis Hopper is David Crosby. And once you see that, you're like, oh, holy shit. And so McGuinn was asked to write songs for the movie, a couple songs for the movie, or perform some songs for the movie. He did two. He did a really good version of a Dylan song, "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding," with Gene Parsons on harmonica. And he did an early version of Ballad of Easy Rider, which was Dylan gets a co-write, but legendarily, the Dennis Hopper or Peter Fonda, maybe Peter Fonda went to Dylan and said, "Man, write us a song so we can be cool." And Dylan's like, "I'll tell you what." And he wrote the first line: "The river flows to the sea. Wherever that river goes, is where you'll find me." And he handed the piece of paper to whoever it was and says, "Give this to McGuinn. He'll know what to do." And he did.
Nice.
He
Uh-huh.
did.
Yeah.
He knew what to do. Finish the whole song,
Uh-huh.
all the lyrics, the melody,
Uh-huh.
there,
Wow.
And so there's
Hmm.
two versions of that though. There's two versions of the Ballad of Easy Rider. If you get the Easy Rider soundtrack, that one is more of an acoustic version. Then when they recorded the album, they're back with Terry Melcher for this record, who produced their first couple of records. He made a much more elaborate commercial version of it. So this was a big rebound for them commercially. Their appearance in that movie made people pay attention to them again. I think that movie used three Byrds songs, the McGuinn songs, and then also Wasn't Born to Follow is in one very important scene and is perfectly used. And so this was a bit of a commercial comeback for them, and it got them going again. And so they started really playing live everywhere and were at sort of a second peak as far as that goes. They were never going to have number one singles again, but they were selling records, they were filling auditoriums, their reputation was as high as it had ever been. Now, one of the things, this album in particular, when I listen to Stones albums from this era, like Let It Bleed or Sticky Fingers or something, I hear a lot of this, like the gospel sort of influences, the way it ranges in its own way from all these different styles. I think that's definitely a big influence on the Stones. Clarence White's guitar playing when you compare it to Mick Taylor's from around this time. It seems like
Mhm.
in a good, not in a rip-off way, but like, oh, that's great.
Right.
That's a real inspiration for how
Uh-huh.
we can sound.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting. I love still how throughout their career they're able to make these songs seem longer than they are. I mean, in a good way. It's just cracking me up looking at the Ballad of Easy Rider was 2 minutes and 1 second, and then there's Ballad of Easy Rider long version 2:26. It's sort of maybe one of the
they
coolest things
suspend
about them.
time. They
Yeah,
suspend
absolutely.
time.
Yeah,
Drones
yeah.
suspend time,
Mhm,
and it's that's that
mhm.
psychedelic thing in every like it's in all of their records. All of every Byrds record, it's there, and that's what keeps me sort of coming back to them. Like there is that edge, of infinity in every single song they do, which lacks in other stuff from the time period. Um, but so this got them cracking, and so the next record with Melcher was really ambitious. They finally got to make their double record, and it was in a cock up. It ended up being called Untitled. It was supposed to be called Phoenix or something like that. And basically, one LP is live, and the other LP was studio. It did contain a bit of a hit, which is Chestnut Mare, which was another song I remember as a child hearing on the radio. Just that hook, once heard, never forgotten. It's just a million miles wide. And it's such a goofy song. It's probably the stupidest song I love, because the lyrics are so
Uh-huh,
silly.
uh-huh.
But the melody just wins you over, and the sincerity of the delivery, the adeptness of the band of reflecting the lyrical material in the song, and how it really does just track perfectly with what you're feeling in the song is just unbelievable. So at this point, they've got a new bassist, Skip Batten, who's much hairier than John York, and in my opinion, a better singer and a better bassist. And now the band cooks because he's kind of funky. He's like, I think he came up playing R&B. He was in a band in the '50s called Skip and Flip that had a little bit of a radio hit or kind of a hit. So he was an industry veteran who was not folk, not country, kind of predated even the kind of rock that we're sort of used to thinking about. And so he goes in the band. He's another perfect person to go in there because he's got a huge wide variety of experience. He can play anything. He can play jazz. He's very jazzy. So they really were able to go off in that direction. One of the highlights of this record is the long version of 8 Miles High, which manages
Yeah,
not to be
amazing.
boring. Like there's a rhythmic interaction, but there's not a dumb drum solo, particularly. It like surges, it goes up and down. And if you want a face full of Clarence White, this has got it. Like it just unstoppable force on that one. But the
Yeah.
studio, so the live side, I think is really good. Like, what did you think of this one?
Oh well, the live two live sides are yeah amazing. I mean they're all great all
The
the way
live
through, and
record.
that yeah the live yeah exactly. And I mean the 8 Miles High takes up a whole side, right? And it's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
great. But all the rest of them are still short, but still really. I mean yeah, it's an awesome live band for sure.
So one of
I
the
love
interesting
it.
things about the studio side of this is it's one of the first places um like the Byrds were recording people like songwriters like Jackson Brown a little bit before other people, or Lowell George, Truck Stop Girl in particular. He was still in the Mothers of Invention during that time. Little Feat hadn't been formed, and Clarence White is already digging up material from these guys. I think the Jackson Brown song is an extra song, but um, Clarence White steps up, and his vocals I think are amazing. Like I think he's sort of underrated in that way. Everything he sings is good. But I love the studio side. I love the way it ends with like I love Hungry Planet. I love some of the dronier stuff that's on there. Chestnut Mare, of course, is classic. Um, and I just think they really, and this was probably everybody was like, oh, the Byrds are back, and this was a real peak for them. They again, the live show just even bloomed even harder. Clarence White just on fire every 10 seconds. They dueling. So it would have been a great time to go see. You have been seeing the Velvet Underground and the Byrds on bills together, just
Yeah.
smoking.
Wow,
Um,
that's insane.
and just a real peak era for them. Now, of course, everything has to come to a crashing halt at some point. And
Well, the
I
studio
think
record is where Kim Fowley starts to have an involvement in the
they're
band, right?
right. Hungry Planet is right, co-written
Hmm.
with him, and
Hmm.
right because Skip Batten and Kim Valley, uh, may he rot in hell, were writing
Right.
songs together. Before anything, I think they were
Hmm.
just friends long before. And
Okay.
the Byrds at this point, as I said before, they have struggled with material now, because now they've got a band where they used to have songwriters, Chris Hillman, David Crosby, Gene Clark in the band. Now Roger McGuinn, not a songwriter like that. He can collaborate, he can arrange, he can take something and make it beautiful, but he isn't somebody to sit down, put a pen down, write a lyric, write a song. He needs somebody to work with. And he was doing some stuff with Jacques Levy, who later on Dylan wrote with, speaking of copying people. And he, some of that stuff's pretty good, but they were writing it for a musical called Peer. They were going to do some version of Peer Gynt, which is like an old opera musical, Russian kind of thing, and maybe a myth. I don't know what you call it, you know. And so that's what Chestnut Mare is from, and a couple other things. And but that never got off the ground, so they would kind of cherry pick songs from that for the last couple of Byrds records. But so this was a bit of a peak in live albums from this era. There's a good one from the Royal Albert Hall in '71, um, and other things like that. They just were on fire. They were at a bit of a peak. They then added a extra percussionist, which gave their live shows a bit more kick. And they were just touring around, having fun, partying, you know, doing that. At some point, though, the specter of a original Byrds reunion started to raise its head. But this kind of blew out this version of the Byrds for material, and they had to come up with 2 records a year, right? So we
Right.
talked about that with contract. So when you've put everything on a double record, what are you going to do next? You know, like, what do you do for material? So they started struggling. So the next 2 records after this are extremely variable. And um,
Right.
this is the first one, Bird Maniacs. This again done
Mhm.
by Melcher. This one came out when the Byrds heard it when they were in England, and they hated it instantly. He had added strings to some songs. It was a weird collection of songs. I would not call it a success. It's probably the first Byrds album. Like, this just isn't as successful as an album. Um, that said, I personally think that the stuff that is McGuinn or Clarence White on this record is as good as anything on any Byrds record. Like, I think I Trust is amazing. I've Pale Blue, that version of Glory Glory. I Want to Grow Up to Be a Politician fits right in. That could be on even Younger Than Yesterday. Um, Jamaica Say You Will, which is a Jackson Brown song, it'll bring tears to your eyes. It's so good, you know. So there's Kathleen's song, My Destiny. So there's like a core of a halfway decent album here, but the stuff that's wildly inappropriate is the Kim Fowley Skip Batten stuff, like Tunnel Love, or that song Citizen Kane.
Citizen
This stuff
Kane.
is that not up to snuff. It shouldn't be on the
Right.
record.
Mhm.
They probably, in hindsight, a different, you know, couple years later. I mean, I don't even know why they didn't do it now. I mean, bands of their ilk at that time would go like put the brakes on stuff and be like, no, we're not done. Like the Stones would do that. They took as long as they wanted. The Beatles, nobody made them finish a record, but somehow the Byrds could still be forced. That said something about their contract. They could still be forced to put out something that they really weren't happy with. So when they heard the roughs for this, they immediately went into a studio in England and in a week recorded another record. But they don't have any songs, you know, like same problem arises. So I don't know why that one is called Farther Along. And I don't know why they didn't mash these 2 up. Like, why somebody just didn't pump the brakes, because these came out. This was recorded and finished before this one was even released,
Oh, wow.
right?
Uh-huh.
And
Mhm.
so why didn't somebody just stop and go like, why don't we just take the best material from these 2 and put them together? I did that on a Spotify playlist, and I can't stop listening to it because it's like so cool, and it really does sound more like Let It Bleed, um, Sticky Fingers era Stones. Like, it's got that kind of rangy feel. There's a lot of gospel tunes that are rocked up in a good way. Glory Glory on here, Farther Along on here is like that. Um, there are some of the songs, like Antique Sandy is really cool. Precious Kate. Now there's a Kim Fowley song. That song is really good. There's a hidden gem in the Byrds catalog. So between these 2 records, there actually is a really good Byrds record, like one that sounds like a Byrds record from 1971 should have sounded. That's going forward. Clarence White would be all over it, like he should, because he's a fucking star. You know, what's
Mhm.
this Kim Fowley? Fuck Kim Fowley. I mean, seriously, like,
Yeah.
you've got Clarence
Yeah.
White, the original,
Mhm.
like everything that Graham Parsons thought he was, Clarence White was, a real psychedelic country musician, like born and bred. And so that's how it should have been. So I made a little Spotify playlist. Like you could probably do it too, where I just literally took all the songs from these two albums sung by Roger McGuinn and Clarence White and lined them all up. I think I did put one I put one Skip Batten song on there because it was a good ending.
Hmm.
Lazy Waters. I thought that was kind of
Hmm.
cool. Now,
Yeah, that's
some of
good
these
stuff.
songs. So, what did you think of these records coming to them?
I pretty much have the same response to you. And to be honest, I should dig into them more because the first time that I've heard each of them, I'm kind of like, okay, there's good stuff on here. I mean, they're still talented people, so they're making music that's still better than a lot of other people's music, but it just doesn't. It didn't seem to like cohere,
No, and
and
another
and
issue with this record in particular
mm,
is this was happening while the Manson trial was going on, and it was being produced by Terry Melcher, who was literally testifying. So I don't know what kind of headspace Melcher was in at the time and whether he had other incentives to try and finish off an album that maybe they should have just sat on for a second, recorded some more stuff. Um, there are some real standout tracks on both of these records. The Clarence White songs in particular are absolutely beautiful. My Destiny. So Clarence White was killed a couple years later, hit by a drunk driver while he's literally loading a guitar into a car after a gig. And then you listen to him sing songs like My Destiny, like Why Do I Live While Others Die, or Further Along. And you're just like, oh, it's just so
right,
heartbreaking.
right,
My favorite,
yeah,
though, the one that just always gets me is Bugler on this one, which is
Bugler.
about a dog. And it's all about Jesus is
I do
coming with
remember that one.
dogs. The
Yeah.
first chord, they strike that first chord, and you're like, the dog's dead. You know instantly that dog is dead,
Right,
and you're going to hear
right,
about it, and you're
right.
going to be crying.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
anybody who's owned a pet, it would be really hard. Your lip starts going. Um, but it also shows that Clarence White was developing into an unbelievable vocalist, and he has a really good country style, great counterpoint to McGuinn's more folk, almost older, ancient kind of sounding style. And the two of them blend really well together. They play really well together. And it's a real shame that, it kind of didn't keep continuing. Um, another big favorite is from the extra tracks of Birdmaniacs. Remember, I said that they had played on these Gene Clark songs that they would bring them back, a couple of these guys, because they liked those songs so much. There is a great take of I think I'm feeling a whole lot better. Feeling I'm
Right.
going to feel
That's
better.
awesome.
That is
Hmm.
unbelievable. It sounds like the Meat
Yeah.
Puppets in the best
Yeah.
way.
That's
Clarence,
really
it's
good.
just the band playing in the studio, just absolutely murdering a song in the casual way that
Hmm.
good musicians do. I love it because on the Gene Clark original, Clarence White plays the solo. On the Byrds version, McGuinn plays the solo, which I think
Oh,
is,
wow.
I don't know why I dig that kind of
That's
stuff, but I
cool.
really do. And he
That's
plays a great
cool.
solo.
Yeah. Hmm.
And Clarence White just sings the hell out of it too, you know.
Hmm. It's
So
funny with their with these two with there's one thing that because I feel like they were pretty good or at least always interesting at album covers and just sort of the aesthetics. I love the way they a lot of these albums have the word bird in the name and stuff.
yeah,
And I think Bird Maniacs is kind of a cool
I
name for
like
an
that
album. And
cover
also
actually. People
and
complain
I mean
about
I
that
do too.
cover. I think it's fine.
And
The
the inside,
inside?
I mean, I would love a record that sounds like this looks. I don't think the record quite does sound like this looks, but I
No.
love the way this is put together.
Right.
It's got a kind of Exile on Main Street almost look
Like
to
it
it.
all should have sounded like that take of I think I'm gonna feel better.
Right,
Then
right,
that
yeah,
would match it.
totally.
Well, I mean, further along is a bit like that because it is definitely
Hmm.
you can hear that that's just the band playing. Like that take of Precious Kate
Right.
sounds like them just standing in the
Hmm.
studio,
Hmm.
banging a song out. So
Right,
there's
right.
definitely good stuff there. If you listen
Hmm.
to like this band for sure, live albums do them justice. Like if you go out on Spotify or you see any of these like live at the Albert Hall 71, Fillmore East 1968, 69, all that kind of stuff, the Untitled live thing, they are one of the best bands of their era, uh, live up there with the Who or any of Velvet's, whoever you can think of who were smoking hot live. They were that and more. Unbelievable. It would suck to follow them at any time because not only were they bumping out hits, but then they were doing like they had Clarence White just ripping, like almost like a vaudeville show. Like, how does he do it? And on top of being great songwriters and having good control of dynamics, they also don't ever seem to have fallen into like drum solos and stuff like that. It's very
Right,
organic
right.
kind of live
Which would
show.
have been easy to do.
Well, it's what everybody else did, except for the
Right.
Who, really.
Mhm.
So one of the things that happened around this time was that whole Byrds world became kind of weird because Crosby, Stills and Nash became literally the biggest rock group in the world, and it gave David Crosby a whole lot of power. But at the same time, everybody's still, like I said, they're hanging out. Like they're all friends. They play gigs together. Hillman went and formed the Flying Burrito Brothers, and almost immediately the Flying Burrito Brothers and the Byrds went on a tour together that would have the last third of the show basically a blended band playing material from both bands. So their world was always Byrds, Byrds, Byrds. They all were always Byrds up to the end, up till David Crosby just died. They were still Byrds together. You can kind of tell even now. And so there was talk of getting the original Byrds back together because I don't know why, but they're just that kind of talk happened. So Crosby, because he was the biggest star at the time, ended up taking the lead on it, and they made uh, this record, which I have never loved. I listened to it recently, and I kind of enjoyed it more than I thought I would. There's some good stuff on it. Anything with Michael Clark playing drums on it is better than anything without Michael Clark playing drums on it. So it's really got a cool groove to it, but not enough Roger McGuinn on the 12 string. It's more of a Gene Clark showcase. He has 3 or 4 songs. They cover 2 Neil Young songs, including an unreleased one, See the Sky About to Rain. Gene Clark sings those masterfully, unbelievably. Um, I think it's good, right? It's okay, but the album itself, uh, it seems almost like they used it as a chance to heal. Like they were like, well, we had a good time making it, is what they were sort of like. And ultimately, McGuinn was like, it seemed like a good way to put the band to bed, to have that be sort of the capper. So he broke up the other Byrds, made this record, and then that was it. They didn't do anything after this record on Asylum. I don't know if anybody thought they would, but they didn't tour really. They didn't really play any shows. They just recorded this record, and that was it for the Byrds. Um, it's an interesting. I wouldn't call it a direction not taken, because I don't think they ever would have gone in whatever this you would call the direction of this record. Did you listen to this one at all?
I've only managed to skim it. Like I said, I listened
Yeah,
to
I
that
don't.
Neil Young cover, which was I liked, but
I don't.
yeah.
It really is. I mean, it's kind of canon in that it's got a pretty good
Mhm.
logo.
Right. Uh-huh. I like the album
Um,
cover. Yeah.
it's a good shot, isn't it?
Hmm.
Nice, stylish.
Yeah.
But it's a little bland, and everybody admits it. They're like, yeah, Crosby had really
Mhm.
good pot. We hung out, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And
Yeah.
sadly, so after making this, uh things were starting, and I think Clarence White would probably have played with a million people. He was at that point a very well regarded guitarist. He was killed by a drunk driver. Uh as I said earlier, literally loading a guitar into a car, just picked off the side of a car, playing a gig with his friends. Gene Parsons at that point quit music, like just couldn't do it. Graham Parsons kind of was never the same because they were very friendly. And having lost some people around that age, you can see how it just kind of would blow a hole in things because you aren't necessarily super aware of your mortality at that time. And a real sudden thing in young adulthood like that is, it just is very devastating for people. Um, Graham Parsons, of course, died 73, right? Somewhere in there. Um, so we're talking just a
Yeah. So
year,
pretty soon after this came out.
right?
Yeah.
Now, Graham Parsons and Chris Hillman had put together the Flying Burrito Brothers. And the first Flying Burrito Brothers, I'm not crazy about. I think it's kind of boring. It's got some good tunes on it, like the Hot Burritos are both good. Christine's tune's kind of cool. But they don't really have a drummer on that record, and it shows. And so the next record, they got Michael Clark. It's called The Last of the, or this one is Burrito Deluxe. And immediate improvement to my ears, and an actual really good, like they're always trying to blend like R&B and country and rock and stuff like that, and they finally really do it on this record. There's some stuff that he used to hang out with Jonathan Richman. There's no way he wasn't aware of the Velvets and stuff, and there's a couple out songs that sound like the Velvets on here. Lazy Days and Older Guys in particular have that Foggy Notion chug. And the whole record really cooks. It's a little janky in its way because they were kind of a janky band. They weren't very smooth, but it's a very underrated record. Um, I had no idea it was any good till I started researching for doing this video with you, and I heard the Lazy Days, and I heard Lazy Days on that extra track, and I was like, that song cooks. What? And so I started looking up every version of that I could find, and that led me to this. And then it also led me to this, which this is a really good record. It's sort of like if the Eagles were worth listening to or something like that.
Right.
And as I mentioned before, Chris Hillman played on that Gene Clark album. He resurrects one of the songs from that Gene Clark album called Tried So Hard. Really very beautiful version of that. Using so where I would say the Flying Burrito Brothers, where the Byrds centered on kind of McGuinn's 12 string, the Flying Burrito Brothers centered on having a pedal steel kind of thing. So they, though, fell apart pretty quickly. And Chris Hillman then went and did stuff with Stephen Stills' Manassas, which is, people like it. And from that point forward, it's all just solo activity. Roger McGuinn did some albums that really didn't sell. Eventually, though, the person who was the most successful coming out of the Byrds was Michael Clark, who joined Firefall, who had massive soft rock hits in the 70s, tons of them. They basically, you can kind of see him standing at the back there. The guy with the mustache, Rick Roberts, was the leader of Firefall. And so when he started putting together song demos, he saw Mike called Michael Clark, and Michael Clark was the drummer. So he sold more records with Firefall than he ever did with the Byrds. So in many ways, most successful Byrds member, Michael Clark. And it turns, from being a guy who people would talk about having to be replaced on the original recordings by the Byrds, he actually ended up being a session guy. And people would talk about having him in a session. He'd come in, he'd been partying the night before, absolutely still kind of loaded. And they go 1, 2, 3, go, and he nails the take. He does it every time. So they were like, whatever. So just a real great natural musician, as a drummer, he's definitely a big influence on me. That loose swing, his arrangements in the first couple of records really underappreciated. Like he's the one who makes Turn, Turn, Turn a hit. That's he made up that drum arrangement, that kind of Latin thing to go with it, all the dynamics to that. That's a very complicated drum arrangement. He also handles really well on those early records, switching time signatures, which they do more than you would think. So going from 4 to 3 or from 2 to 3 or 4, he just does it like falling off a log, which is not easy to do for any musician. So that kind of takes us up to the end of the Byrds. There's a lot of extraneous Byrds. The Sanctuary series is really good, that Sundays did. This has probably a lot of these are extra tracks on the CDs that you saw, but if you like vinyl and these things are out and about, this has every kind of extra thing, and each of these concentrates. Like this one's more about Graham Parsons, this one's more about the Clarence White era, this is the Psych era, this is their first couple records. And so that's really good. They have another Best of the Byrds Volume 2, which isn't really a best of because they didn't have any hits. But it's kind of an interesting listen and not a bad place to kind of check out late period studio Byrds. But it's got Citizen Kane on here, right? Which is terrible. And but it's got some other good stuff on there, and it's okay. Like it's not a bad mashup of the ending of the Byrds. If you just want to dip your toe in and see, well, maybe I want to check out some of those things, it's not a bad place to start. They definitely are different, but still great in their way. In the 80s, this is the first sort of thing that came out with versions of stuff that nobody had ever heard, including the original RCA version of 8 Miles High, which everybody claims is better, but is not. I don't know why. The CBS version, plainly, it seems to me, is better. And this is the first place we heard Triad was on here. And then, I don't know, every home should have this. This is the mono version of Columbia Singles Collection, double album. I don't know if this is still in print. Maybe it is. It's definitely, if you're on a streaming service, this is a great listen. you could just put this on even in order or hit shuffle or whatever. And there's just every single song, just a murderer's row of classic 60s records, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And it really does speak to their legacy that they were both this kind of a singles band, and they made all of these groundbreaking records
Yeah.
and innovated sonically and
Hmm.
innovated otherwise. So
Totally. And I should also, for people who are
that's
going to watch this who haven't maybe delved into them at all and want to, and or if you're into CDs and you want to go cheap to begin with, I mean, this box, which has
yeah, highly
all
recommended.
all it has every album we talked about except the last one, all in these really cool gatefolds with the spines and everything. I think I got on Amazon for $40, maybe
Yeah,
45, I think,
shipped.
something.
Yeah,
So I mean,
like yeah,
it's crazy
the
deal. So
sound on those is absolutely sick too. Like
yeah, yeah,
sometimes I'm just like, oh, I got to hear it crystal clear, and I'll put one of those on. They did a
uh-huh,
really good job with the sound, and
yeah.
the extra tracks are all phenomenal. Really
Oh, so
well,
many
it's
great
well
tracks.
programmed.
And a nice booklet with information on every track and everything.
Yeah,
It's really
yeah.
worth. It's definitely the starter's kit for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's all you would need, you know, and
Yeah.
I mean I have fun. I've been buying the records since I was a kid, so it's a little different for
Right.
me, but I would tell
Uh-huh.
anybody that box set is one of the, it's
Yeah.
just incredible,
It
and it
really
is
is.
an experience, sort of like the Fall Peel sessions, like just start at disc one and go all the way to the end, and
Yeah.
it's a trip
Yeah. It
in a way
is.
that a lot of other
Totally.
bands, it's sort of shocking how far they go for a band that really just has a reputation of doing this one particular thing.
Yep.
That's what keeps
No,
me
I
coming
definitely
back
found
to
that
them.
for sure. Hmm.
Definitely, like it's sometimes I'll just get a Jones for one of their weirder, jankier albums just because it's so weird and all over the map, you
Right.
know. And
Yep.
um,
Yep.
so,
Yep.
so
Absolutely.
what's your summing
That's
up of all of this? That was
well, I think your point about them being a singles band that were also an album band more than any other band from that era, except maybe the Who. It's definitely a thing that I don't think a lot of people sort of understand. Although they have famous albums that are considered great as albums, but I don't know. I don't think you really understand it until you've listened to all the albums. How much they were masters of that form, as much as they were singles band too.
right.
So that's number one. And I think I definitely the Clarence White thing. I don't think I even really knew who he was before I started delving into the albums, especially because he's on more of the later stuff. But yeah, definitely incredible.
Yeah,
Um,
he might be
so
one of the more underrated musicians of the era. Like, I mean, I
right.
suppose if he'd lived, he'd be a little better known.
Hmm.
But I can only imagine a lot of those people at the time just sitting around slack-jawed awe of what he's pulling
Right.
off. Because
Right.
there's
Totally.
nobody, I can't think of any, even now, anybody doing that
Hmm.
is kind of just doing him. You know, some of the country people
Hmm.
like Marty Stewart or um, will do that kind of sound. But I
Hmm.
don't know. There's something he's really, the way he thinks harmonically is something you just can't make up. And it's a
Hmm.
weird nexus of, like I said, the psychedelic thing, the country thing, the bluegrass thing, the pop
Hmm.
thing, and him knowingly inserting it into these things. Just a really clever musician. There's all this
Hmm.
other stuff underneath, like his rhythm guitar playing is ridiculous, and the chords he chooses under McGuinn when McGuinn's singing and playing the 12 string are just they either disappear so completely into the 12 string that they just make it like a 15, you know, like a bigger 21 string or whatever you'd call that, or they just I don't know. It's just really, and he's always
Hmm.
up to something. Like if you listen
Yeah,
to a track that he's on, he's
yeah,
there's always
and what a
something to
thing
listen
to
to,
have him to have been such a great band and have him come in
right?
midway through. It's like if John Cale joined after the third album or something. It's
Right.
just something wild, you know. It's amazing to have had that two eras of a band that way that are so
And to discover, like, how
amazing.
many
Yeah.
talents did they discover in the Byrds, you know? I mean, like
Right,
it's like,
right.
you know, Chris Hillman, we don't think of it, but he is one of the great country musicians of his generation, because after he quit the Byrds and quit Manassas, he then started doing country stuff, and he did Desert Rose Band, which is an extremely successful country band in the 80s. They
Uh-huh.
made hit
Yeah.
after hit after hit in the country
Uh-huh.
contest. And so um you know, he was also extremely successful, and McGuinn now does folk stuff mostly.
Hmm.
But that's all he ever wanted to do anyway. Like the Byrds was sort of his foray into pop, and
Right.
you know,
Right. Yeah.
and so yeah,
Yeah.
this says there's. I'm glad you found them interesting too. You know, because
Oh yeah.
they've stuck. Like they're a band that I
Hmm.
heard when I was a kid, and you just keep accumulating the records and listening, and there's
Hmm.
always something new there to listen to somehow. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
when as a kid, I liked them. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Then when I took acid,
Mhm.
they dropped in another slot. You know, like when I heard them during
Right.
that period, I was like, oh,
Uh-huh.
oh, oh,
Right.
oh, oh, okay,
Uh-huh.
all right. Another layer peels away, you know, and I'm a
Right.
musician and there's other stuff that peels away. And that's the
Mhm.
sign of a really good band. Like I
For
love the
sure.
Stones and everything for what they are, but ultimately the Stones, aside from a couple records there, they don't have a ton of depth. There you're going to get
Mhm.
R&B, you're going to get gospel, you're going to get, you know, Black American song form given back to you in a conscientious, you know, not a ripping off way, but in
Mhm.
the Stones way. Whereas the Byrds, you just all bets are off. Like you could drop a needle on a record and you never know what's going to pop up, and it's always
Right.
going to be musical and it's always going to be different, you know.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
hail the
Yeah, well, that
Byrds.
was awesome.
Go listen to the
I
Byrds.
learned a lot. I learned a lot through
Did
that.
you?
I appreciate that. So yeah, and
No,
just
no
having
problem.
listened to them recently too has been awesome. So
Okay.
cool. Awesome. Well,
So
thanks
this
for
was our
people
first
for
sidebar, you
watching
know,
this.
that's kind of
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, we're going to plan on doing more of these definitely as we go along, especially uh, truly sidebars like this. This does relate to one episode we did, and we'll probably do some more sort of spin-offy sidebars from some of the other episodes too. And we appreciate people sticking around to watch or
Yes, and I
listen or both.
appreciate you letting me rant about the Byrds, Mark.
Oh, I love it.
That's my lifelong
We could
dream.
go on for another couple hours, I'm sure.
We probably could, yes.
Yeah.
All right, man.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.